The morning after the widow's sudden death was crisp and pale, the kind of chill that made breath visible and the village rooftops sparkle with frost. St. Mary Mead had taken on an unusual hush, as though the village itself were holding its breath, waiting for someone to speak first and break the uneasy silence. Miss Marple, seated by her sitting-room window with a steaming cup of tea in hand, watched the few early risers move about the high street, their faces set with curiosity and tension. She had learned long ago that when something disrupted the ordinary rhythm of village life, it was seldom the surface details that mattered most. Her eyes followed the baker as he carried a tray of rolls to the shop, noting how he avoided looking at the Pembroke residents and the postman, who lingered a moment too long outside the widow's house, as though uncertain whether to deliver the morning letters. Miss Marple's mind began its subtle weaving, threading the faintest gestures into a pattern that might later reveal more than any glance or whispered rumor. By 10 o'clock, the news had spread through the village like wildfire, carried from doorstep to doorstep by housemaids, grocers, and gossiping neighbors. Mrs. Price Ridley had already gathered a small audience outside the post office, asserting with theatrical confidence that she had seen something suspicious near the widow's garden gate the previous evening. "I tell you, she was not alone," she said, wagging a finger. "I saw a shadow flit past the window just as the lamp was lit. You mark my words. This wasn't an accident." The younger women exchanged glances, nodding solemnly, while the men muttered quietly, some in disbelief, some in reluctant acknowledgement. Miss Marple, observing from a respectful distance, noted how readily the village took the story and built upon it, embellishing details with each telling. Such embellishments were revealing in themselves, for they betrayed the fears, desires, and assumptions of those who whispered them. By mid-morning, the constable arrived at the widow's house, accompanied by a cautious yet determined Inspector Craddock, who had been called in from the neighboring town. The inspector moved briskly, checking the front door, examining the windows, and noting the arrangement of furniture. Miss Marple, invited quietly into the drawing-room by the housemaid, lingered at the threshold, her eyes drifting over the carefully arranged teacups, the half-finished letter, and the faint smudge of violet on the writing desk where the widow's hand had rested. She observed the posture of the maid, Alice, who hovered nervously near the doorway, her hands wringing the edges of her apron. Young Alice had been visibly shaken the previous evening, and Miss Marple could see that her recollections, though sincere, were fragmented by fear and suggestion. "Quite a shock for the village," Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than anyone else, as she stepped lightly across the rug. "One must wonder whether it is the heart that falters or the mind that panics." She knelt to examine the letter more closely, noting the careful handwriting and the unusual red seal. Her eyes flicked to the teacup on the desk, its placement slightly askew, suggesting it had been moved in haste. The faint scent of lilac, mingled with a trace of something more acrid, lingered in the air. Miss Marple's fingers brushed lightly over the desk, tracing an almost invisible indentation in the blotter. Small details, easily overlooked by those intent on the dramatic, often carried more significance than the loud and obvious. She filed each observation away, allowing them to simmer quietly, aware that in time these subtleties would speak volumes. Outside, the village continued to murmur and speculate. Mrs. Price Ridley had relocated to the church steps, where she now claimed she had overheard Mr. Forbes in the early hours, pacing and muttering to himself. Others, less confident, offered half-heard reports of a carriage passing too late in the night, of lights flickering in the drawing-room window, of shadows seen and then gone. Miss Marple, listening patiently while keeping her presence unassuming, noted the contradictions and overlaps in these accounts. The inconsistencies themselves were a kind of clue, revealing the villagers' tendency to perceive events through the lens of their own assumptions and fears. As the day progressed, Inspector Craddock called together the household staff and close neighbors for formal questioning. He was efficient and methodical, but Miss Marple observed the pauses, the hesitations, and the subtle avoidance of certain topics. She noticed the maid's careful choice of words, the gardener's glance toward the vicarage, and the way the widow's neighbors emphasized minor disagreements with her in life while downplaying her recent interactions. Each behavior, she realized, was a thread in the larger tapestry, one that might eventually reveal the shape of motives, intentions, and perhaps even concealed resentments. By late afternoon, the initial shock had begun to settle, replaced by a tense curiosity. The villagers had returned to their errands, though many lingered in doorways and windows, casting furtive glances toward the widow's house. Miss Marple, seated once more at her window with the soft light of winter falling across her knitting, reflected quietly on the morning's observations. She understood that this was only the beginning, that beneath the surface of grief and speculation lay subtle forces shaping the story, forces that would not be revealed through panic or gossip, but through patience, attention, and the gentle probing of human nature. She sipped her tea thoughtfully, noting the precise angles of the widow's front window and the way the shadows moved within the drawing room, and allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The village might imagine chaos, but Miss Marple knew that the truth, as always, was quietly waiting to be uncovered. And so, as the day waned and the long shadows of the late afternoon stretched across the frost-glittering green, the first hints of the mystery's threads began to appear. Subtle, almost invisible, yet certain to unravel in time under the watchful eye of Miss Marple. Each movement, each whispered rumor, each seemingly trivial observation was a step along the path to a truth that would demand careful, patient attention before it revealed itself fully. For in St. Mary Mead, even the quietest death could conceal the most profound secrets. By the following morning, the village of St. Mary Mead had settled into a subdued rhythm, though an undercurrent of tension lingered in the crisp winter air. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and made her way along the frost-silvered lane toward the widow's house, her mind occupied with the events of the previous evening. She had spent hours replaying the subtle movements, the expressions of those present, and the little gestures that had seemed inconsequential but, in her experience, were rarely so. The vicar, Reverend Leonard, had been conspicuously absent from the house when she arrived, yet the faint imprint of his boots in the hallway suggested an early visit. Miss Marple paused at the gate, noting how the frost crunched unevenly, indicating hurried steps in and out of the garden. She inclined her head slightly as though acknowledging a message left in the snow, though the sender was unknown. Inside the drawing room, the maid, Alice, fussed nervously with the tea tray, her fingers trembling over the delicate cups. Miss Marple offered a small, reassuring smile. "Good morning, Alice. You slept at all last night?" The girl shook her head. "Hardly, ma'am. I kept thinking about Mrs. Pembroke. It doesn't seem possible that she's gone." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind remained alert. "I know, dear. Yet sometimes understanding the reasons behind events helps us carry them more lightly." She glanced around the room, taking in the arrangement of furniture, the writing desk still holding the half-completed letter, and the faint indentation where the widow's hand had rested. Every item seemed charged with meaning, each one a silent witness to the morning of discovery and the hours preceding it. The postman arrived shortly after 9, carrying a bundle of letters that included the correspondence the widow had meant to send to Mr. Henry Forbes. Miss Marple watched discreetly as he placed them upon the table, his eyes darting toward the desk as if anticipating some revelation. "Extra busy day," he remarked casually, though his voice betrayed unease. Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. The handling of letters often tells as much about human nature as the words themselves." The postman frowned slightly, uncertain whether she spoke of him or the household, and moved on, leaving the bundle, neatly arranged for later perusal. By mid-morning, Inspector Craddock had arrived to begin formal inquiries. His approach was efficient, procedural, but Miss Marple noted the subtleties he missed. The slight hesitation of Alice when asked where she had been the previous evening, the almost imperceptible glance of the gardener toward the back gate, and the faint smudge of violet on the window-sill suggesting a hurried adjustment of the curtain. The inspector questioned the maid, the gardener, and a neighbor who claimed to have heard a muffled argument late at night. Each response, while seemingly trivial, carried nuances that spoke to underlying tensions. Miss Marple listened attentively, her mind quietly connecting the threads without ever revealing the full picture to those around her. The first visitor of significance was Mr. Forbes himself, who arrived under the polite escort of Craddock. His expression was composed, yet there was a tension about him, a slight tightness of jaw, and an alertness in his eyes that suggested he was calculating the situation as much as observing it. Miss Marple noted the small details, the way he placed his hat carefully upon the table, as if to avoid leaving any fingerprints, the subtle adjustment of his gloves, and the almost imperceptible glance toward the writing desk. She reflected on his relationship with Mrs. Pembroke, recalling whispered rumors and the hushed speculations overheard in the cafe the previous day. While his outward demeanor was calm, his careful movements betrayed a consciousness of responsibility and perhaps of fear. Throughout the morning, villagers continued to gather outside the gate, exchanging hushed observations and conjecture. Some claimed to have seen a carriage passing at an odd hour. Others insisted they heard voices raised in argument. Miss Marple, observing from the window across the green, catalogued each version with her usual patience, noting contradictions and consistencies alike. She saw that the accounts, while fragmented, created a lattice of human behavior, fear, curiosity, and the desire to be part of a story that would eventually illuminate the truth more than any overt evidence. By midday, Miss Marple had requested a quiet moment with Alice, who led her discreetly into a corner of the kitchen. "Alice, did anyone enter the drawing-room yesterday besides you and Mrs. Pembroke?" The maid hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the door, and then whispered, I think the vicar came, ma'am. He didn't say much, just looked around and left." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And the night before? Anyone else?" Alice shook her head. "No one I saw, ma'am, except sometimes the gardener lingers near the gate after dark. I've wondered what he does, but I never thought to ask." Miss Marple made a small note in her mind, recognizing that the interplay of visitors, staff, and silent observers could conceal motivations or reveal them in small, telling gestures. By the afternoon, Craddock had completed preliminary interviews and was gathering statements for the formal report. Miss Marple, while outwardly unobtrusive, reviewed the scene once more, her eyes catching the faint indentation on the back of the letter, the slight displacement of a chair, and the scuff marks along the hallway carpet. Each observation reinforced her suspicion that the narrative the village was forming of accident, sudden illness, or tragic oversight was incomplete. There were layers yet to be uncovered, subtle manipulations of perception that only the careful attention of someone accustomed to human nature could discern. As the day waned and the light grew softer, Miss Marple lingered by the window, watching the villagers return to their homes with expressions of curiosity and unease. She considered the widow's half-finished letter, the unremarkable teacup now resting neatly upon the tray in the shadowed corners of the drawing-room. It was clear to her that the outward calm of St. Mary Mead belied deeper currents of fear, secrecy, and perhaps even hidden resentment. Each small gesture, each overheard word, each glance exchanged in passing would prove crucial in the days to come. For in her experience, the truth of human action rarely revealed itself immediately, and in this village it would take patience, observation, and quiet reasoning to uncover the widow's silent secret. By the next morning, a thin veil of fog hung over St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of cottages and hedgerows and lending an almost ethereal quality to the village green. Miss Marple set out early, wrapping her scarf tightly against the damp chill, and made her way to the edge of the widow's house, where the morning light glinted faintly on frost-kissed windows. The previous day's events had left the villagers anxious and speculative, and already rumors were circulating, each more fanciful than the last. Miss Marple, walking with her usual unhurried grace, noted the cautious steps of the gardener as he tended the frost-laden borders, the wary glances of neighbors toward the house, and the hurried passage of a milk-boy who glanced repeatedly over his shoulder as though expecting a scandal to leap from the fog. Each behavior, she knew, carried meaning beyond the surface, revealing the anxieties, loyalties, and unspoken judgments of the village populace. The front door of the widow's house was ajar when she arrived, and inside, the atmosphere retained the residue of grief and tension from the day before. Inspector Craddock had begun his formal inquiries, and Miss Marple watched discreetly as he questioned the maid, Alice, and the gardener, noting the subtle cues each gave away. Alice's hands trembled slightly as she recounted her movements, and the gardener's eyes flicked repeatedly toward the study, as if unwilling to meet Craddock's gaze for long. Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest, nearly imperceptible nod, registering these as quiet, but telling indicators of unease, awareness, and perhaps a concealed truth. The widow's writing desk remained undisturbed, though the half-finished letter, its red wax seal faintly cracked, seemed to radiate a significance that eluded the casual observer. By mid-morning, the vicar, Reverend Leonard, arrived at the house, accompanied by a neighbor who claimed to have heard raised voices the previous night. He entered with polite formality, his eyes taking in the room with a careful neutrality that did not entirely mask the tension beneath. Miss Marple observed the subtle stiffness of his posture, the way his fingers lingered momentarily on the back of a chair, and the slight shift of his weight as he listened to Alice recount the events. He spoke calmly but with precision, ensuring that his presence did not dominate the proceedings, yet each measured movement suggested the careful management of appearances. Miss Marple, silently taking note, recognized the familiar signs of a man accustomed to guiding narrative and perception, shaping what others saw without appearing to do so. Meanwhile, villagers had gathered outside, drawn by the gravity of the widow's death and the tantalizing possibility of scandal. Some spoke of an unexpected carriage moving in the night, others of flickering lights in the drawing-room window, and still others of a muffled argument heard through the fog. Each account differed slightly, sometimes contradicting the last, yet patterns began to emerge. The repeated mention of visitors at odd hours, the attention to minor disturbances in the garden, the emphasis on the widow's composure in life as evidence of potential secrets. Miss Marple, listening discreetly from the window across the green, catalogued these observations with a patient mind, recognizing that inconsistencies and embellishments often revealed as much about human nature as any physical evidence. In the study, Inspector Craddock began a methodical review of the widow's possessions and documents. Miss Marple, standing quietly at one side, observed how he catalogued items with procedural care, yet overlooked what she considered the finer points: the faint smudge of ink beside the letter, the indentation of a second teacup, and the subtle placement of a small key on the blotter. These minute details, she realized, held significance precisely because they were so easily disregarded by those unaccustomed to reading human intention and subtlety. She allowed her eyes to drift over the room once more, mentally recording each detail, each gesture, and each slight shift in the occupant's behavior. Shortly after noon, Mr. Henry Forbes arrived, summoned by Inspector Craddock to provide information about the widow's affairs. His entrance was calm but deliberate, the careful positioning of his hat and gloves betraying a consciousness of observation. Miss Marple noticed the almost imperceptible tension in his jaw, the quick glance toward the writing desk, and the momentary hesitation before answering Craddock's questions. While outwardly composed, these small behaviors hinted at a mind-managing responsibility, perhaps discomfort, and certainly an awareness of how each action might be perceived. Throughout the afternoon, Miss Marple quietly conversed with Alice, eliciting minor but crucial details. The times visitors arrived, subtle movements in the garden, and the sequence of sounds heard through the walls. Each revelation, while seemingly trivial, added to the growing lattice of understanding she was constructing. She noted how the maid's reticence reflected both fear and loyalty, how the gardener's casual remarks concealed more than they revealed, and how Mr. Forbes' careful attention suggested knowledge not fully disclosed. By evening, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing a village still under a gentle pall of curiosity and apprehension. Miss Marple, returning home along the frost-lined lane, reflected on the day's observations with a sense of quiet determination, understanding that the widow's silent secret would not reveal itself quickly, but would emerge from patient attention to the smallest human details, gestures, and unspoken words. The morning air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp clarity that made the village feel unusually alert, as though even the cobblestones and hedgerows were holding their breath in anticipation of revelation. Miss Marple walked slowly along the high street, her steps deliberate, her eyes noting everything that moved or lingered. The villagers were beginning to resume their routines, yet a certain hesitation marked their gait, a sense that behind polite conversation and mundane errands lay a shared awareness of the recent tragedy. The widow's house, still cordoned off by the small cluster of officials, seemed to loom silently at the edge of perception, its windows reflecting pale winter sunlight like watchful eyes. Miss Marple's thoughts were already tracing the sequences of yesterday, the late-night visitors, the half-finished letter, and the subtle disturbances in the study that had initially seemed insignificant, but now hinted at deeper undercurrents of intention and secrecy. By mid-morning, she found herself at the gate of the house, greeted by the faint stir of activity as Alice, the maid, fussed with the arrangements of flowers and tidied the small area by the doorway. Miss Marple's gaze swept over the scene, noting how the teacups remained aligned precisely on the tray, how the slight shift in the blotter suggested someone had handled the letters after the initial disturbance, and how the faint dust marks on the windowsill hinted at hurried, perhaps secretive, movements. She inclined her head toward Alice. "You seem to have been very busy this morning, dear. Did anything unusual happen while you were tidying?" Alice hesitated, fingers twisting the hem of her apron. I think the gardener came in early, ma'am. I didn't hear him arrive, but there were footprints in the frost that didn't belong to anyone else." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, registering each detail. The gardener had been considered merely peripheral, but Miss Marple knew that those who appeared on the periphery often held the key to overlooked truths. Inspector Craddock arrived shortly afterward, his expression carefully neutral, yet betraying the slightest tension in the crease of his forehead. He'd already begun formal questioning of neighbors and staff, yet his focus remained on tangible evidence, letters, locks, and timelines. Miss Marple, standing quietly in the corner, observed the subtle discrepancies in his approach. He asked precise questions, but the pauses he allowed for answers was sometimes too long or too short, revealing his reliance on procedure over intuition. She noted how Alice's responses were carefully measured. The gardener's demeanor alternated between defensive and cooperative, and Mr. Forbes, once called to the scene, maintained an exterior calm that could not entirely conceal the flickers of unease in his eyes. Each movement, each hesitation, each slight adjustment of posture was a thread in the web of human behavior that Miss Marple had learned to read with quiet precision. By noon, the village gossip had intensified outside the cordoned perimeter. Mrs. Price Ridley, as usual, had gathered a small audience of neighbors at the corner of the green, sharing her theories about late-night visitors and suspicious glances she had witnessed. Others whispered of overheard arguments, the arrival of a carriage at an unusual hour, and the widow's demeanor during her last public appearance. Miss Marple, standing slightly apart, catalogued the remarks silently. She understood that the inconsistencies in these accounts were not mere error. They were reflective of each speaker's perspective, biases, and underlying fears. Patterns emerged when examined carefully, subtle shifts and repetitions that indicated truth beneath the surface of exaggeration and conjecture. The afternoon brought Mr. Forbes into the study once again. He had been summoned by Craddock to provide clarifications about financial matters and the widow's recent correspondence. Miss Marple observed how he handled the letter now laid upon the desk, his fingers brushing it lightly before placing it down, the faintest hesitation betraying internal calculation. His measured speech, careful eye contact, and slight shifting of weight indicated awareness of observation and the careful management of impression. Miss Marple, noting these subtleties, recognized that the outward calm masked a complex interplay of responsibility, concern, and the strategic control of perception. Each deliberate gesture, each fraction of hesitation, would ultimately contribute to the understanding of motive and action. Meanwhile, Miss Marple took the opportunity to speak privately with Alice in the kitchen. The maid, reassured by the detective's gentle tone, disclosed additional details. The precise timing of footsteps, subtle sounds in the study late at night, and minor disturbances that she had initially thought irrelevant. Miss Marple listened attentively, recognizing that these fragments, when connected with the outward behaviors of other villagers and visitors, would reveal a lattice of intentions and misperceptions. She noted the maid's fear, loyalty, and selective memory, understanding that these human factors often revealed more than documents or overt evidence ever could. As the day drew toward evening, the light softened across the village, casting long shadows from the trees and buildings, and Miss Marple returned to her own home with a quiet sense of purpose. She considered the half-finished letter, the slightly displaced teacup, the traces of movement in the garden, and the behaviors of all who had entered the widow's house. Each element seemed minor on its own, yet together they formed a network of subtle signals, small acts, and unconscious confessions that would ultimately illuminate the truth. Patience, careful observation, and understanding of human nature were her guides, and she knew that the widow's silent secret would only be revealed in its entirety to those willing to see beyond the obvious, beyond the dramatized accounts and the whispered rumors, into the realm of subtle gesture and quiet intent. The morning after the second day of questioning brought a quiet tension over St. Mary Mead that seemed almost tangible, settling over the high street and lingering in the frost-bitten hedgerows. Miss Marple, having risen with the soft winter sun, took her usual route past the bakery and the post office, noting the unusually alert expressions of the villagers as they went about their errands. The widow's house remained under watch. A subtle crowd gathered beyond the gate, exchanging whispered theories and careful conjectures. Miss Marple paused for a moment to observe, her sharp eyes noting the slight stiffness of the gardener as he arrived carrying tools for routine maintenance, the postman's cautious glances toward the study windows, and the hurried steps of young Alice who delivered letters to the nearby cottages. Each movement, however ordinary it might appear, was another piece in the complex tapestry of human behavior that Miss Marple had learned to read so attentively. Inside the house, the atmosphere retained a residue of the previous day's grief, now tempered by an undercurrent of anticipation. Inspector Craddock moved about with the precision of a man accustomed to procedure, though he seemed less attuned to the subtleties of human nature that Miss Marple observed so instinctively. He questioned the maid, Alice, again, probing the timeline of the widow's last hours, while his eyes darted from the study to the hall and back, measuring reactions and hesitations. Miss Marple watched closely as Alice described her movements, the small tremor in her hands betraying a nervous awareness of scrutiny, and the occasional downward glance toward the teacup tray that seemed to imply she was recalling more than she dared to speak. Miss Marple noted these reactions with quiet appreciation, understanding that truth often revealed itself not in direct statements, but in the fleeting gestures of the careful and fearful alike. By mid-morning, Mr. Forbes arrived at the house, having been summoned to clarify the widow's financial matters and to explain the contents of her unsent letter. His manner was courteous, almost studiously composed, yet Miss Marple perceived the subtle tension beneath the surface, the way his fingers lingered on the back of the writing chair before he allowed himself to speak, the slight tightening of his jaw when he glanced at the envelope with the cracked wax seal, and the careful modulation of his voice to convey calm. Each gesture, each controlled breath, suggested a man deeply aware of the consequences of his presence and of the perceptions of those around him. Miss Marple made a mental note, recording the combination of caution, awareness, and perhaps hidden apprehension as another thread in the wider pattern she was beginning to discern. Outside, the village murmured on, carrying the story of the widow's demise through the crisp winter air, embroidered with conjecture and punctuated by curiosity. Mrs. Price Ridley, ever eager to assert her insight, recounted yet again her observations of mysterious late-night visitors and imagined quarrels, while others argued over the timing of carriage arrivals and strange lights in the study. Miss Marple, observing from a discreet distance, catalogued the narratives carefully, noting discrepancies and consistencies alike. It was in these contradictions, she understood, that the truth often hid. Human nature, she had long observed, rarely revealed itself clearly when filtered through the filter of rumor and personal bias. By early afternoon, the investigation within the house had turned toward the finer details. The placement of teacups, the faint smudge of violet on the windowsill, the slight indentation on the blotter, suggesting someone had handled the documents. Miss Marple, quietly following the inspector's methodical movements, allowed herself to examine these subtle signs more thoroughly. She noted the faint traces of a second teacup being moved, the unusual alignment of furniture that implied someone had been interrupted, and the carefully smoothed areas on the carpet that hinted at hurried footsteps. Each observation, though minor to the untrained eye, reinforced her understanding that the narrative of accidental death might conceal something deliberate, subtle, and human in its motivation. During a quiet moment, Miss Marple spoke privately with Alice in the kitchen. The girl, reassured by her calm and gentle manner, disclosed further details. The precise timing of footsteps on the stairs, muted argument overheard while delivering letters, and minor disturbances in the study that she had initially disregarded. Miss Marple listened attentively, appreciating the fragments not as isolated events, but as interwoven strands that might reveal a pattern once connected to the behaviors of the widow's visitors, staff, and neighbors. The subtle hesitations in Alice's speech, the slight avoidance of eye contact, and the careful modulation of her tone all added layers of understanding, confirming that human nature often provided more clues than any document or object ever could. By late afternoon, the inspector had concluded preliminary inquiries and allowed a brief pause for the household to regain a sense of normalcy. Miss Marple lingered in the drawing-room, her eyes taking in the widow's writing desk, the half-finished letter, and the faint indentation in the blotter where her hand had rested. The soft winter light illuminated the small details. The ever-so-slight displacement of a chair, the smudge of ink, and the delicate positioning of the tray. To most, these were trivialities. To Miss Marple, they were signals, hints of interrupted intentions and concealed motives, all waiting patiently to be interpreted. As the evening shadows lengthened across the village, Miss Marple left the house with a quiet resolve, her mind already connecting threads, noting movements, gestures, and omissions that others overlooked. The villagers, absorbed in their daily routines, remained unaware that the widow's silent secret had already begun to reveal itself to the discerning observer. She understood that patience, careful attention, and an unwavering focus on the subtleties of human behavior would ultimately illuminate what had occurred, and that the days ahead would require both vigilance and gentle scrutiny before the true story emerged fully. The next morning dawned pale and brittle, with frost glinting like crystal across the village rooftops and hedges, and Miss Marple set out with a quiet sense of purpose. St. Mary Mead seemed subdued, as if the recent events had left the village holding its collective breath, each villager tiptoeing through their routines as though afraid of disturbing some delicate balance. The widow's house remained cordoned off, its windows reflecting the winter light with a muted brilliance, while the usual hum of daily activity took on a tentative, almost hesitant quality. Miss Marple paused at the corner of the lane, watching the postman make his deliveries with careful glances toward the study window, the baker adjusting his tray as he greeted a neighbor, and the gardener moving with measured steps, tools in hand, but eyes alert. Even in these ordinary motions, she saw subtle clues, the avoidance of certain paths, the momentary freeze in reaction to a glance, that suggested tensions and secrets yet to be revealed. Inside the house, Inspector Craddock had resumed his inquiries, methodical and precise, yet still somewhat blind to the nuances that Miss Marple so deftly perceived. He questioned Alice once more, her hands twisting nervously in her apron as she recounted details of the previous night's events. Miss Marple observed how Alice's eyes flitted toward the window-sill, then back to the inspector, betraying a mix of fear and unspoken understanding. The maid's loyalty and apprehension intertwined in subtle gestures, revealing more than her words alone could convey. Miss Marple noted the indentation left on the blotter by the widow's hand, the faint displacement of a teacup, and the subtle smudge of violet on the desk, each minor detail forming a pattern that, to anyone else, might seem insignificant, but to Miss Marple spoke volumes about the sequence of events and the possible movements of others in the house. By mid-morning, Mr. Forbes arrived once again, summoned to clarify lingering questions about the widow's affairs and the contents of her incomplete correspondence. He entered with carefully measured steps, hands adjusting the lapels of his coat before settling them, eyes briefly flicking toward the letter with the cracked wax seal. His composure, though outwardly calm, betrayed a faint tension, the brief tightening of his jaw, the careful modulation of his voice, the deliberate pacing of his responses. Miss Marple observed all of these nuances, recognizing that his awareness of scrutiny, combined with subtle gestures, could reveal both conscious and unconscious truths. The way he positioned himself in the room, the moments when he hesitated, and the slight shifting of weight all contributed to a larger picture of a man whose inner life was as intricate and deliberate as the widow's own secrets. Meanwhile, the village continued its quiet murmur of conjecture, neighbors exchanging hushed remarks about late-night visitors, flickering lights, and the widow's recent interactions with friends and relatives. Miss Marple, standing slightly apart, catalogued these accounts with careful attention, noting contradictions and consistencies. The discrepancies were not random. They revealed the villagers' personal biases, fears, and desires, showing how each perceived events through a lens uniquely their own. Some accounts exaggerated details of movement or tone, others downplayed significant gestures, and the intersections of these reports offered Miss Marple the beginnings of a map, not of physical evidence, but of human behavior, where subtle truths hid beneath layers of assumption and speculation. In the study, Inspector Craddock began to examine the finer details, the positioning of chairs, the alignment of teacups, the small but telling smudge of ink near the blotter. Yet he overlooked what Miss Marple considered the critical subtleties. A second teacup slightly displaced, the faint impression of footprints near the back of the room, and the gentle tilt of a framed photograph that suggested someone had handled it recently. Miss Marple moved quietly among the furniture, tracing the lines of disturbance with her eyes, recording impressions in her mind, understanding that it was in these almost imperceptible anomalies that the widow's last movements and the intentions of those around her would reveal themselves. During a brief pause in the inspector's inquiries, Miss Marple took Alice aside in the kitchen, encouraging her to recount small, seemingly trivial observations that might otherwise have been forgotten. The maid disclosed the timing of subtle sounds, the creak of floorboards, the muffled rustle of curtains, a low voice raised for only a moment before falling silent. Miss Marple absorbed these fragments, aware that human behavior, as much as physical evidence, would ultimately illuminate what had occurred. The maid's selective recollection, combined with her visible nervousness and instinctive loyalty, was a key that could unlock aspects of the evening that no official document could capture. As the afternoon light waned and long shadows stretched across the village lanes, Miss Marple returned to her own home, pausing to consider the day's observations. The faint disturbances in the study, the gestures of Mr. Forbes, the hesitations of Alice, and the murmured gossip of the villagers all formed a delicate lattice of human interaction that, when viewed together, suggested the outlines of the widow's secret and the circumstances surrounding her death. Patience, careful observation, and understanding of character, Miss Marple knew, would gradually reveal the truth. She sipped her tea thoughtfully, acknowledging that St. Mary Mead, so seemingly serene and predictable, harbored subtleties that only the attentive eye could perceive, and that the widow's silent secret was slowly but surely beginning to unfold under the gentle scrutiny of a mind attuned to human nature. The following morning, St. Mary Mead seemed to wake with a cautious air, the villagers moving along the frost-lined lanes with a mix of habitual routine and quiet apprehension. Miss Marple, as ever, rose early and took her walk along the familiar paths, noting with quiet satisfaction how the ordinary motions of daily life, milk deliveries, shop-front tidying, the clipping of hedges, revealed subtle truths to the attentive eye. The widow's house loomed silently at the edge of the village, its windows reflecting the pale winter sunlight in a way that seemed almost accusatory, as if the building itself were a witness waiting to testify. Miss Marple paused at the gate to observe the gardener, who lingered slightly longer than necessary, and the postman, whose casual glances betrayed an underlying curiosity that did not escape her notice. Each movement, however innocuous, contributed to the evolving understanding of human behavior that she relied upon so instinctively. Inside the house, Inspector Craddock had resumed his methodical inquiries. He questioned Alice yet again, his voice precise, his questions measured, though he remained oblivious to the delicate signals her body language offered. Miss Marple watched as Alice's fingers twisted nervously in her apron, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the study and then away, revealing not hesitation born of ignorance, but the fear of speaking something that could alter perception. The indentation on the blotter, the slight displacement of the teacup, and the faint smudge of violet ink were details the inspector might note, but Miss Marple understood them as pieces in a larger puzzle of intention, secrecy, and subtle communication. The quiet interplay of gesture and silence, the unspoken acknowledgments among those present, all provided her with insights that would remain invisible to the casual observer. By mid-morning, Mr. Henry Forbes arrived again, summoned to clarify lingering matters related to the widow's correspondence and her finances. He entered with the carefully measured composure of a man aware of observation, yet Miss Marple noted the subtleties betraying the tension beneath his exterior calm. A slight stiffening of the shoulders, a faint twitch of the fingers as he brushed against the writing desk, and a momentary pause before speaking, as though weighing each word for its impact. His awareness of scrutiny and the careful control of outward impression provided Miss Marple with clues not of fact, but of character, hints of thought and feeling hidden beneath cultivated civility. She allowed her gaze to linger on him subtly, recording the combination of caution and internal calculation, understanding that such nuances would be crucial in revealing the truth of the widow's final hours. Outside, villagers gathered in small clusters, their murmured conjectures filling the crisp air with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and speculation. Accounts of late-night visitors, carriage movements, and flickering lights varied widely, each altered by perception and personal bias. Miss Marple observed silently, cataloguing contradictions and consistencies with careful attention. She knew that within these disparities lay subtle truths. Human nature rarely spoke plainly, yet patterns emerged when one watched long enough. The villagers' gossip, their anxious gestures, and their selective recollection were all reflections of inner fears and loyalties, offering as much insight as any concrete evidence might provide. By early afternoon, attention returned to the widow's house. Inspector Craddock examined the minutiae: the placement of furniture, the alignment of teacups, the slight smudge near the blotter. But he overlooked the smaller, telling signs. A second teacup slightly displaced, faint footprints by the window, and the subtle tilt of a photograph that suggested it had been handled recently. Miss Marple observed each with quiet appreciation, her mind connecting the dots invisibly, aware that these minute details formed a map of intentions, interruptions, and possible concealments. Each small disturbance was a whisper of human action, revealing gestures of care, secrecy, or perhaps even fear, waiting patiently for interpretation. During a brief lull in the questioning, Miss Marple took Alice aside in the kitchen, encouraging her to recount minor observations previously overlooked. The maid spoke softly of faint noises on the stairs, muted words exchanged in the study, and fleeting movements behind closed doors. Miss Marple considered these disclosures not as isolated facts, but as interconnected threads, each contributing to the broader pattern of the widow's final hours. Alice's hesitancy, the careful selection of what to reveal, and her instinctive protective loyalty were all human signals that illuminated more than any document ever could, guiding Miss Marple's reasoning along subtle paths that led toward truth. As the afternoon waned and shadows lengthened across St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet reflection. The minor disturbances in the study, Mr. Forbes's measured comportment, Alice's selective disclosures, and the villagers' murmured gossip all coalesced in her mind into a delicate lattice of behavior, intention, and hidden motive. She knew that patience, close attention, and careful understanding of character would be essential to uncovering the widow's secrets. The outward calm of the village belied the intricate interplay of fear, loyalty, and human frailty that governed the actions of those within and around the widow's house. Each subtle gesture, each pause in speech, and each shift of weight was a clue, and Miss Marple, as ever, would observe with gentle precision, waiting for the moment when these quiet signals converged to reveal the truth hidden in plain sight. The morning unfolded over St. Mary Mead with a brittle clarity, frost glinting along hedgerows and rooftops as Miss Marple took her familiar walk through the village lanes, noting with her customary attentiveness how even ordinary motions carried subtle truths. The widow's house remained shrouded in quiet significance, its windows reflecting the pale winter sun in a way that seemed almost watchful, as if the building itself observed the unfolding scrutiny. Villagers passed along the high street with an unusual hesitancy, glancing toward the house or lowering their eyes as they went about their errands, and Miss Marple saw meaning in each glance, each tentative step, and each whispered exchange. Even the postman, careful with his deliveries, and the gardener, moving with deliberate caution, revealed something in their restraint, hinting at tensions that belied the village's outward calm. Every gesture, she knew, was a thread in a larger tapestry of human behavior, waiting to be read by a discerning eye. Inside the widow's house, Inspector Craddock resumed his inquiries with procedural diligence, questioning Alice the maid yet again about the previous night's events. Her hands twisted nervously in her apron, eyes darting between the inspector and the study, betraying the anxiety that tempered her words. Miss Marple observed the indentation on the blotter where the widow's hand had rested, the slight displacement of a teacup, and the faint smudge of violet ink. Details that might appear trivial but spoke to her trained mind of interrupted actions and concealed intentions. The subtle interplay of silence, gesture, and hesitation revealed more than any direct statement, and Miss Marple catalogued each minute sign, aware that the unspoken often held the key to understanding. By mid-morning, Mr. Henry Forbes arrived once more, called to clarify lingering questions concerning the widow's affairs and the half-finished letter. His steps were measured, his composure deliberate, yet Miss Marple detected the faint stiffness in his shoulders, the subtle twitch of his fingers as they brushed the writing desk, and the brief hesitation before he spoke. Signs of careful calculation and awareness of observation. Each gesture and controlled breath suggested the presence of internal deliberation, a consciousness of consequences and perception. Miss Marple noted these subtleties, recognizing that understanding character often revealed motives and truths more reliably than documents or testimony alone. Outside, small clusters of villagers murmured conjectures regarding the widow's activities, late-night visitors, and flickering lights in the study. Accounts varied, some exaggerating, others downplaying. Yet Miss Marple catalogued the consistencies and contradictions with careful attention. The discrepancies were telling, revealing each speaker's fears, biases, and desires, offering insights into human nature and the undercurrents of the community. Patterns emerged within the inconsistencies, providing hints that no overt evidence could supply. In the study, Inspector Craddock scrutinized the finer details, the alignment of chairs, the teacups, the smudge near the blotter, but overlooked smaller, telling signs. A second teacup slightly displaced, faint footprints near the window, and the subtle tilt of a framed photograph. Miss Marple's eyes traced these anomalies, understanding them as evidence of interrupted movements, concealed actions, and perhaps even deliberate manipulation. Each minor disturbance contributed to the broader understanding of events and intentions, forming a lattice of behavior that spoke more clearly than any spoken words. During a pause in the formal questioning, Miss Marple spoke privately with Alice in the kitchen, encouraging her to recall seemingly trivial details. The maid described faint creaks on the stairs, muted words exchanged in the study, and fleeting movements behind closed doors. Miss Marple absorbed these fragments, seeing them not as isolated facts, but as interconnected threads leading towards the truth. Alice's hesitations, her protective instinct, and her selective disclosure were all signals, human behaviors that conveyed meaning beyond words, illuminating aspects of the widow's last hours that no formal inquiry could reveal. As afternoon waned and shadows stretched across the village, Miss Marple reflected quietly on the day's observations. The displaced teacup, Mr. Forbes's controlled composure, Alice's disclosures, and the villagers' whispers coalesced in her mind into a subtle web of behavior, motive, and secrecy. Patience and careful attention would be required to untangle it fully, yet the signs were already emerging. St. Mary Mead, outwardly serene, harbored intricate human dynamics, and Miss Marple, with her accustomed precision, would continue to observe, understanding that the widow's silent secret was revealing itself slowly in gestures, pauses, and quiet telling movements. The following morning, a thin mist clung to the streets of St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the cottages and lending the village an air of tentative suspense. Miss Marple walked along the familiar path past the post office and the bakery, noting with her keen eye the slightest tremor in the hands of those she passed, the careful avoidance of certain glances, and the unusually measured steps of children on their way to school. Even ordinary movements seemed to carry significance, hints of unsettled thoughts and restrained anxieties that might otherwise escape notice. The widow's house remained under quiet surveillance, its windows reflecting the faint winter light, and the soft crunch of frost beneath the gardener's boots echoed faintly from the side gate, as though even the ground had secrets to share. Miss Marple paused for a moment, observing the subtle interplay of human behavior, noting the postman's meticulous placement of letters, the careful distance maintained by passing neighbors, and the occasional hesitant glance cast toward the study, Each detail, trivial to the untrained eye, formed a mosaic of intentions, fears, and concealed truths that she catalogued silently, adding to the intricate map of human conduct she had been building over the preceding days. Inside the house, Inspector Craddock moved with his habitual precision, resuming the line of questioning he favored, yet still focusing primarily on physical evidence and chronological accuracy rather than the subtleties of character. Alice, the maid, answered as best she could, her fingers twisting nervously in her apron, eyes flicking toward the study and back with a mix of apprehension and instinctive caution. Miss Marple observed these small gestures, understanding that they spoke volumes about fear, loyalty, and the careful selection of what to reveal. The faint smudge of violet ink on the blotter, the imperceptible tilt of the photograph on the desk, and the displacement of the second teacup, all these minor anomalies formed part of a larger pattern, hinting at actions and movements that were both deliberate and concealed. While the inspector recorded statements with procedural diligence, Miss Marple's mind wove together the human elements behind the evidence, noting that intentions often left traces in behavior that were more telling than the material facts themselves. By mid-morning, Mr. Henry Forbes arrived, yet again, summoned to clarify lingering matters regarding the widow's finances and her incomplete correspondence. His entrance was careful and measured. He adjusted his coat, smoothed his hands along the desk, and allowed his eyes to linger momentarily on the letter with the cracked wax seal. To the casual observer, his demeanor might have seemed calm and precise, yet Miss Marple noted subtle tics, the brief tightening of his jaw, the shifting of weight from one foot to another, the faint pause before speaking, signs of internal calculation and the careful management of impression. She observed these nuances silently, recognizing that the combination of vigilance, caution, and latent unease often revealed more about character than any testimony ever could. The interaction between the maid, the visitor, and the inspector played out in small gestures, glances, and hesitations, each carrying potential significance in the unfolding understanding of events. Outside, villagers whispered and gestured, sharing fragments of information and conjecture. Mrs. Price Ridley and her acquaintances debated the timing of visitors, the movement of carriages, and the widow's demeanor during her last known appearance, their accounts often conflicting yet revealing in their inconsistencies. Miss Marple catalogued these narratives carefully, noting that the contradictions themselves were informative, reflecting individual fears, assumptions, and perceptions. Within these disparities lay subtle truths, patterns of behavior and motive that, when examined with patience and discernment, illuminated aspects of the situation invisible to the casual listener. The village's gossip, while colored by bias and imagination, provided Miss Marple with insight into the social fabric surrounding the widow, the relationships that might influence behavior, and the pressures that might lead to concealment or deception. By early afternoon, attention returned to the study, where Craddock scrutinized the minutiae, the alignment of chairs, the arrangement of teacups, the faint impressions on the blotter, but he remained oblivious to the smaller, telling details. The second teacup ever so slightly askew, the faint footprints near the window, and the subtle displacement of a photograph that suggested recent handling. Miss Marple traced these anomalies with quiet appreciation, understanding them as evidence of hurried movements, interrupted actions, and concealed intentions. Each tiny disturbance was a clue, a whisper of human behavior, revealing gestures of care, fear, and secrecy, waiting to be interpreted. During a momentary pause in formal questioning, Miss Marple spoke privately with Alice in the kitchen, encouraging the young woman to recount minor observations she might otherwise have dismissed. The maid spoke softly of faint creaks on the stairs, fleeting voices exchanged behind closed doors, and small movements in the study that had gone unnoticed. Miss Marple absorbed each fragment, recognizing how these seemingly trivial details interwove with the behaviors of Mr. Forbes, the inspector, and the villagers themselves. The subtle hesitations, instinctive protective loyalty, and carefully managed disclosures were all signs pointing toward understanding, a network of human signals that, when observed patiently, could reveal the widow's secret. As the day waned and winter light softened, Miss Marple walked back to her own home, reflecting quietly on the accumulating observations. The minor disturbances in the study, the gestures of those present, and the hushed village conversations all formed a delicate lattice of behavior, intention, and secrecy. She knew that patience, close observation, and an understanding of character would be essential to uncovering the truth fully. St. Mary Mead, outwardly calm and serene, harbored subtle complexities, and Miss Marple, with her practiced eye for the nuances of human conduct, understood that the widow's silent secret was gradually revealing itself in gestures, pauses, and the unspoken truths of ordinary life. Now, generate the final section of the story, ensuring a satisfying resolution. Maintain the logical progression of clues and character arcs, delivering the final reveal smoothly while keeping the ending impactful and true to the detective style. Miss Marple had spent the morning quietly reviewing every detail she had observed over the past days, retracing her steps in the house and reflecting on the subtle behaviors of those involved. The displaced teacups, the faint smudge of violet on the blotter, Mr. Forbes' carefully controlled manner, and Alice's hesitant disclosures all formed a pattern she had been piecing together in her mind. The village moved on with its daily routines, oblivious to the conclusions being drawn in the small parlor at the heart of the mystery, and Miss Marple understood that timing was critical. The truth, delicate and easily disturbed, required the proper moment to emerge. When the inspector arrived to discuss the final points of his investigation, Miss Marple invited him to sit quietly in the drawing room while she began to speak in a gentle, unassuming manner, leading him through her observations as though they were merely musings. She pointed out the slight displacement of the second teacup, the faint footprint near the window, and the tilt of the photograph, each minor anomaly presented with the innocence of a village curiosity rather than accusation. Craddock followed her lead, noting the details but still uncertain of their meaning, as Miss Marple allowed her attention to drift naturally toward Mr. Forbes, who had been summoned under the pretense of clarifying the widow's affairs. Forbes entered, with his habitual composure, yet Miss Marple's quiet observations had already accounted for his measured hesitations, the brief flicker of unease when his hands brushed the desk, and the subtle tightening of his jaw as he glanced at the cracked wax seal of the unsent letter. She engaged him in gentle conversation about minor matters, the widow's habitual routines, her correspondence, and her daily interactions, watching carefully for any reaction that betrayed awareness, guilt, or concealment. It was in these small reactions, so easily missed by the casual observer, that Miss Marple found the key. The moment arrived when Forbes, responding to an offhand remark about a delivery schedule, unconsciously revealed his knowledge of the exact timing of the widow's interrupted correspondence, the very detail Alice had recalled so nervously. His eyes flickered just briefly, and a tension entered his posture that could not be masked. Miss Marple noted it, allowed it to settle, and continued her gentle questioning until the pattern of inconsistency became undeniable. She then laid out her reasoning in calm, precise language, as though recounting a story rather than delivering judgment. The widow's habit of preparing her letters meticulously, her final unfinished correspondence, the second teacup, and the subtle disturbances in the study all indicated someone had been present in her room under circumstances meant to conceal the truth. The faint smudge of violet suggested an object had been handled. The footprints marked a hurried presence, and the slight tilts in framed photographs revealed interruptions that no visitor of casual intent would have produced. Combining these observations with the behavioral cues, The hesitations, the controlled gestures, and the fleeting reactions, Miss Marple demonstrated that only one person had the knowledge, access, and motive to intervene in the widow's final hours: Henry Forbes. She traced the thread of motive carefully, explaining that financial arrangements and the contents of the widow's unsent letter provided both opportunity and incentive. Forbes, she observed, had believed he could manipulate the situation without detection, relying on his outward composure and the seeming plausibility of ordinary behavior. Yet human nature, Miss Marple noted with gentle firmness, reveals itself even in the most carefully rehearsed gestures. The subtle signs that had gone unnoticed by the inspector, Alice's nervous recollections, the slight smudges, the displacement of everyday objects, formed a narrative of deliberate interference, a quiet orchestration of events meant to mask intention behind civility. Confronted with her observations, Forbes initially attempted the practiced calm he had relied upon, but the precision and insight of Miss Marple's deductions left no room for evasion. His composure cracked, his voice faltered, and the carefully maintained barriers of deception dissolved under the gentle pressure of her reasoning. Inspector Craddock, following Miss Marple's line of thought, finally understood the evidence of behavior, the human patterns that pointed to guilt, and the sequence of events that had culminated in the widow's untimely demise. The room held a tense stillness as Forbes at last confessed to his actions, his words confirming what Miss Marple had long suspected. With the revelation complete, Miss Marple allowed a moment of quiet reflection, acknowledging the somber nature of justice, even as the truth restored order to the village. The household, once clouded by suspicion and subtle tension, could begin to heal, and St. Mary Mead could resume its routines, tempered by the knowledge that human behavior, carefully observed and patiently understood, would always illuminate what mere appearances might obscure. She reflected on the enduring truths of human nature, the intertwining of fear, loyalty, ambition, and secrecy, and, as always, remained quietly assured that patience, discernment, and a gentle eye for detail would reveal the hidden patterns that govern even the most ordinary of lives.